In the early 1900s, Thomas and Margaret Calloway, a young American couple, were eager for a fresh start. They had met in New York, where Thomas had made a name for himself as an ambitious businessman, and Margaret, a charming woman from a wealthy family, had a keen interest in art and history. They quickly fell in love, and soon after their marriage, they decided to leave the bustling cities of America in search of a new life. The opportunity came when Thomas received word from his distant uncle, who had recently passed away, that he had inherited a grand estate in England, a place called Ravenwood Manor. Ravenwood Manor was a grand yet enigmatic property that had been left in a state of disrepair for several years. The estate was nestled on a hilltop in the heart of the English countryside, surrounded by a thick forest that seemed to stretch for miles. Its grandeur, albeit faded, still held an eerie allure. The manor had once been a thriving home, but it had fallen into neglect after the mysterious death of its previous owner, and the locals in the nearby village spoke of strange occurrences surrounding the house. The house's remote location only added to its ominous reputation, making it seem like a place out of time. Despite the rumors and the warnings from friends and family, Thomas was excited about the idea of living there. He saw it as an opportunity to escape the relentless pace of city life and build a family in a quiet, isolated setting. Margaret at first had her doubts. She had always loved the idea of a countryside life, but Ravenwood Manor's long history and the unsettling reports from Thomas's family made her uneasy. Her relatives, who had heard strange tales of the house's dark past, warned her not to take the risk. They spoke of the manor being cursed, its walls soaked in tragedy, and how several other families who had come before them had experienced unexplained phenomena. They told Margaret of people who had vanished without a trace, of objects that would move on their own, and of eerie figures seen lurking in the windows on stormy nights. Some believed that Ravenwood Manor was haunted by spirits from a time long past. However, Thomas, ever the optimist, dismissed these as mere superstition. He was determined to restore the manor to its former glory, believing that he could turn the property into a beautiful home for himself and his new wife. He even thought that the manor's history would add to its charm, as he imagined himself writing about the grand estate, or perhaps opening it to the public one day as a historical landmark. After much persuasion, Margaret reluctantly agreed to the move. She wanted to support her husband, and her love for him outweighed her growing concerns. Besides, she reasoned, how bad could it really be? The house was old, yes, but surely it was nothing that a little hard work and dedication couldn't fix. They packed their belongings and traveled across the Atlantic, their hearts full of hope, albeit clouded with unease. When they arrived at Ravenwood Manor, the house appeared exactly as they had imagined, stately but forlorn, its stone walls covered with ivy and moss, and its windows dimmed by years of neglect. The large oak doors creaked as they entered, and the cold air seemed to hang heavy, almost as if the house had been waiting for them. Yet, despite the worn-out exterior, the grandeur of the estate still shone through. The couple couldn't help but feel a sense of awe. They were now the owners of a once great house, and they planned to make it their home. However, their excitement would be short-lived. The first few days passed without incident, and they busied themselves with organizing the house, settling into their new life. But even as they worked, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. It wasn't the house itself. It was the unsettling silence. The manor was too still, too quiet. The dense forest surrounding the house cast long shadows, and the wind seemed to moan through the branches in a way that unsettled her. Thomas, however, was too busy with plans to fix up the manor to notice his wife's growing apprehension. He was determined to prove that he had made the right decision, but little did he know that Ravenwood Manor was not just a place in need of repair. It was a place steeped in darkness, and the house itself seemed to have plans for the Callaways, ones that neither of them could. Ravenwood Manor had a history that few cared to speak of. It was a house that had seen centuries of change, but more than that, it was a house that seemed to hold within its walls the weight of a dark legacy, one shrouded in rumors, tragedies, and misfortune. The manor had been built in the late 1600s by a wealthy nobleman who had strong ties to the local community. For many years, it was known as a place of grandeur and sophistication, a mansion where aristocrats from across England would gather to discuss politics, art, and society. The surrounding lands were lush and fertile, and the estate prospered, making it a beacon of prosperity for the area. However, beneath the polished surface, Ravenwood Manor was far from the ideal home it appeared to be. It was said that the manor had been built atop ancient grounds, lands that were sacred to a long-forgotten pagan cult that had once lived in the area. Some believed that the land was cursed, that the spirits of the old ways still lingered restless and angry at the desecration of their sacred sites. The first tragedy occurred shortly after the manor's completion, when the original owner died under mysterious circumstances. Some reports suggested he had fallen from a great height. Others said he had been struck down by an unseen force. His death was sudden, and there was little explanation. His widow, left in mourning, quickly sold the estate and moved away. The house changed hands several times over the next century, with each family who moved into Ravenwood Manor seemingly meeting a similar fate. The local villagers spoke of the house as if it were alive, its windows watching, its walls whispering, and its doors creaking with sorrow. The most notorious tale of Ravenwood's dark history began with a woman named Eleanor Graves, who arrived in the early 1700s with her young daughter. Eleanor was a widow who had heard of the house's splendor, and she believed that it would be a fresh start for her and her child. However, soon after they moved in, Eleanor began to hear strange sounds. The house seemed to take on an unnerving character of its own, groaning in the dead of night, and flickering lights that never quite stayed still. Some nights Eleanor would wake to the sound of footsteps, soft but deliberate, echoing down the long, empty hallways. But the noises were only the beginning of what Eleanor would face. The dark energy within Ravenwood began to affect her mental state. She grew paranoid, convinced that someone, or something, was watching her. She started to speak in ways that bewildered the local townspeople, muttering to herself about shadows that had followed her from the house's past. Her daughter too grew ill and often complained of seeing figures in the mirrors, figures that did not belong in this world. The final act in Eleanor's tragic story came one stormy night when she was found at the bottom of the manor's grand staircase, her body twisted in an unnatural way. The villagers were horrified, but the death was ruled as a tragic accident. However, some whispered that Eleanor's descent was no accident at all. Many believed that she had been pushed by an unseen force. What was certain, though, was that her death marked the beginning of Ravenwood Manor's reputation as a house plagued by death and misfortune. Eleanor's daughter disappeared shortly after her death, and the manor was abandoned once more. Over the years, the house continued to change owners, but the pattern remained the same. People who entered Ravenwood seemed to be consumed by its malevolent energy. The spirits of those who had lived there appeared to linger, their suffering and torment reaching out to anyone unfortunate enough to cross the threshold. Ravenwood Manor had become a symbol of doom, a place where life, hope, and happiness were inevitably swallowed by darkness. It was in this setting that Thomas and Margaret Calloway would soon find themselves. As they began to settle into their new home, they had little knowledge of the terrible history that had shaped the estate. No one in the nearby village had warned them in any meaningful way. The locals were far too superstitious to speak openly, fearful that discussing the dark past of Ravenwood would provoke the spirits that still haunted it. But as the days passed, Margaret began to feel the unsettling presence that had haunted so many before her. Ravenwood Manor was not just a house. It was a prison for the restless souls of the past, and it was eager to claim new inhabitants. Little did they know, the house was already aware of their presence. The first few days in Ravenwood Manor were at first quiet. Thomas and Margaret Calloway spent their time cleaning and unpacking, attempting to breathe life into the decaying mansion. However, it wasn't long before they started noticing things that didn't seem quite right. At first, the occurrences were small, nothing too alarming, but the subtle signs soon became impossible to ignore. One of the first things Margaret noticed was the temperature fluctuations. Despite the fireplaces being lit and the windows tightly shut, certain rooms remained chillingly cold, while others felt stiflingly warm. It was as though the house itself had its own moods, shifting from one extreme to the next without explanation. At night, Margaret would sometimes wake in the early hours to hear faint whispers, barely audible but unmistakably there, like the hushed voices of someone speaking, just out of reach. When she tried to investigate, however, the sounds would stop, and she'd be left with nothing but the silence of the empty house. Thomas, preoccupied with his plans to restore the estate, brushed these off as the result of an old, poorly maintained house. He often joked that the house was simply settling as they moved in. But Margaret was less certain. One evening, after a long day of unpacking, she sat alone in the grand sitting room reading by candlelight. Suddenly, the candle flickered and went out. The room fell into darkness, and before she could relight the wick, she felt something cold brush against her neck. She froze, her heart racing. When she turned, there was no one there. It was as though the air itself had changed. By the end of the week, the strange events escalated. Furniture began to move on its own. One morning, Margaret entered the dining room to find the chairs rearranged, as if someone had been sitting there, even though she and Thomas had gone to bed the previous night without moving a thing. Even stranger, the furniture didn't seem to have been moved by hand. It was as though they had been shifted by an invisible force. Objects began to disappear and reappear in odd places. A silver spoon would vanish from the kitchen counter, only to be found hours later on the mantelpiece. A set of family portraits that hung in the hallway seemed to shift positions overnight. The faces in the paintings appeared to change too, subtly, as if the people in the images were slowly losing their resemblance to the originals, taking on new, unfamiliar expressions. As the days wore on, Margaret's unease grew into dread. One night, she awoke to the sound of footsteps pacing in the hallway outside their bedroom. She shook Thomas awake, but when they went to investigate, no one was there. The house seemed eerily still, yet it felt as though something was watching them, lurking just beyond the walls. The final straw came when Margaret began to have vivid dreams that felt too real. In these dreams, she saw herself walking through the darkened halls of the manor with shadows trailing behind her, whispering her name. The whispers grew louder each night, and the shadows seemed to grow stronger, more menacing. In one particularly vivid dream, Margaret found herself in the grand staircase, looking up at the ornate chandelier that hung above. A figure appeared. At the top of the stairs, a tall, shadowy figure with hollow eyes and a twisted smile. The figure reached out toward her, and she awoke in a cold sweat, gasping for air. Thomas, though sympathetic to his wife's fears, was still convinced that the strange happenings were just a figment of her imagination. But Margaret knew that something was wrong. The house wasn't just old, it was alive, and it was watching them. As the days passed, Margaret's health began to deteriorate. She was exhausted, pale, and thin. She stopped eating regularly, and her once lively eyes grew dim. The strange happenings didn't cease. In fact, they only seemed to intensify. Margaret's connection with the house deepened in a way that she couldn't understand, and she felt an overwhelming compulsion to remain there, despite the overwhelming fear. Thomas knew he had to take action before things got worse, but he couldn't shake the nagging thought that Ravenwood Manor was far more than just an old house. It was a place of deep, dark power, and it was beginning to claim its first victim. As the weeks passed, Margaret's condition grew worse. What had started as a sense of unease turned into something far more sinister. Her physical and mental state deteriorated rapidly, alarming Thomas and anyone who had the misfortune of seeing her. The once vibrant woman who had been full of life and excitement was now a mere shadow of herself, a husk hollowed out by something dark and malevolent. Her appearance was the first noticeable change. Margaret's face became gaunt, her skin sallow and cold to the touch. She lost weight at an alarming rate. Her once lustrous hair grew limp and dull. Her eyes, which had once been filled with warmth and curiosity, were now sunken and glassy, with a look of fear and confusion. It was as if something had drained the life from her, like the house itself had claimed a piece of her soul. At first, Thomas thought her condition could be due to stress. Perhaps the move had been too overwhelming for her, and the strange events in the house had left her mentally exhausted. But as the days went by, he realized that something far more sinister was at play. Margaret's behavior became increasingly erratic. She would often speak in a low, monotone voice as though in a trance, repeating phrases that made no sense. "The house will claim us," she would mutter. "We are not meant to leave." Thomas tried to comfort her, but she was often distant, lost in thoughts that seemed incomprehensible. One evening, Thomas found Margaret sitting in the sitting room, her eyes fixed on the grand mirror hanging on the wall. When he asked her what she was doing, she replied in a voice that didn't sound like her own. "She watches me," Margaret said, her gaze still fixed on the mirror. "She waits for me to join her." Thomas looked into the mirror, but there was nothing there, just the reflection of the empty room. Yet, Margaret seemed to be speaking to someone invisible, someone only she could see. It was at this point that Thomas began to consider the possibility of possession. The events in the house had already left their mark on her, but now it seemed that the spirit of the manor was taking full control. Margaret's connection to the house was deepening, and whatever dark force resided within its walls was drawing her further into its grasp. Thomas knew he had to act fast, but he didn't know what to do. The more he tried to help, the more Margaret seemed to slip away. Her nightmares intensified. She no longer woke up screaming in fear, but when she did wake, her eyes were wild with terror. She spoke of dark figures that moved in the shadows, of voices that whispered her name from the corners of the house. She would wake up in strange places, sometimes in the cellar, sometimes on the grand staircase, as if she had wandered in her sleep, driven by forces beyond her control. What was most unsettling, however, was the way Margaret seemed to change before his eyes. It wasn't just her body, it was her very soul. There were moments when Thomas would catch glimpses of something darker in her eyes, something that wasn't Margaret at all. Her once gentle demeanor was replaced by bursts of rage, and she would lash out at him, shouting and cursing in languages Thomas didn't understand. These outbursts were followed by moments of calm, where Margaret would act like nothing had happened, as if the storm within her had never occurred. Her possession was undeniable now, and Thomas, terrified and helpless, began searching for answers. He turned to old texts about the manor, trying to understand what could be done to save his wife. But deep down, he feared that it was already too late. Margaret was slipping away, and the house was claiming her, piece by piece. It wasn't long after Margaret's condition worsened that the first real encounter with the paranormal occurred. One that would leave Thomas terrified and convinced that Ravenwood Manor was truly haunted. He had dismissed the strange occurrences at first, writing them off as simple imagination or the house's old creaks and groans. But when he witnessed something firsthand, there was no denying it any longer. One stormy evening, Thomas returned home late after speaking with a local historian about the manor's past. The wind howled outside and the rain lashed against the windows. He opened the door to the sitting room expecting to find Margaret resting, but instead, the room was empty. The only light in the room came from the flickering fire in the hearth. Thomas called out her name, but there was no response. It was then that he noticed something strange. The mirror, one of the few things in the room that still seemed to gleam with some sense of life, was fogged up. The condensation on the glass had formed a shape, one that Thomas could not at first identify. He stepped closer, and as the figure became clearer, his heart skipped a beat. It was a woman, her face distorted and smeared, but there was no mistaking. Frozen with fear, Thomas reached out to touch the glass. As his hand made contact with the mirror, the image of Margaret seemed to come alive. Her face twisted into a grotesque expression, her eyes darkened and filled with malice. In a voice that wasn't hers, she whispered, "You should have left when you had the chance." Before Thomas could react, the image vanished, leaving the mirror as clear and cold as it had been before. He stumbled backward, his heart pounding in his chest. He ran upstairs to check on Margaret, but she wasn't in their room. Panic set in. He rushed through the house calling for her until he finally found her in the cellar, standing motionless in the dark. Her eyes were glazed, her body rigid, and her lips whispered the same words she had spoken in the mirror. "She's coming, for us." Desperate and terrified, Thomas knew that he could no longer ignore the haunting presence within Ravenwood Manor. His beloved wife, Margaret, had changed beyond recognition, her physical and mental decline accelerating at a terrifying rate. The whispers she heard, the visions she experienced, they weren't just figments of her imagination. They were real enough to tear at the very fabric of their existence. In his desperation, Thomas turned to the one thing that many people in such situations had turned to before: a priest. He sought out Father Edmund Holloway, an elderly but well-respected clergyman from the nearby village, who had a reputation for helping people who had encountered the supernatural. Father Holloway was a quiet, solemn man who had dealt with his own share of strange happenings over the years. He listened intently as Thomas described the frightening events at Ravenwood Manor, the whispers, the strange movements, and Margaret's worsening state. Father Holloway agreed to come to the manor the next day. When he arrived, he was immediately struck by the oppressive atmosphere that hung over the estate. He could sense something dark, something ancient, living within the walls of the manor. As they walked through the hallways, he muttered a prayer, under his breath as though trying to shield himself from the evil that was lingering. When they reached Margaret, Father Holloway was horrified. The woman who had once been vibrant and full of life now resembled a shell of a person. Her eyes were vacant, her skin pale and ashen, and she didn't react to the priest's presence. It was as if her soul had been ripped from her, leaving her body a mere vessel for whatever entity had taken hold. Father Holloway immediately began to prepare for an exorcism. He knew it would not be easy, but he was resolute. He told Thomas that the spirits in the house were strong, and the only way to save Margaret was to rid the house of its dark influence once and for all. He set up candles around the room and recited ancient prayers as he called upon the divine to expel the dark forces from the manor. The air grew thick with tension as Father Holloway's voice grew louder. Margaret, still silent and unmoving, suddenly began to tremble. Her body twitched, uncontrollably, her head jerking to one side in an unnatural angle. Thomas felt his stomach drop as a low, guttural voice escaped from his wife's mouth. Not hers, but something else's. The voice was deep, mocking, and filled with a cruel malevolence. "Foolish man," the voice hissed. "You think you can drive us out? You think you can save her? She belongs to—" Father Holloway's eyes widened, but he didn't falter. He continued with the exorcism, his words growing more forceful. Yet, as the ritual progressed, the dark presence only seemed to grow stronger. The temperature in the room plummeted, and the candles flickered violently as if caught in a wind that was impossible to see. Margaret's eyes snapped open, no longer her eyes but dark, empty pits that seemed to stare right through Father Holloway, as though challenging him. Suddenly, the room was filled with a deafening roar, a sound so unnatural that it shook the very foundation of the house. The walls seemed to close in around them, the shadows stretching longer, reaching out like hands to drag them all into darkness. The priest's voice trembled for a moment, but he pressed on, now chanting louder, his words echoing through the manor. And then with a violent crash, the entire room went silent. The air, which had been thick with oppression, suddenly lightened. Margaret collapsed, her body going limp. The dark presence that had overtaken her seemed to have vanished. But Father Holloway knew it wasn't over. The house itself had fought back, and the evil that lingered there was far from gone. Father Holloway warned Thomas that the manor itself was cursed, and no exorcism, no matter how powerful, would fully rid it of its darkness. It would take time, and perhaps more than one ritual, to weaken the evil forces that resided within the walls. But for now, Margaret was free, at least temporarily. Father Holloway left with the chilling knowledge that Ravenwood Manor was far more dangerous than either Thomas or Margaret could ever have imagined. Despite Father Holloway's efforts, Thomas found no relief in the days following the attempted exorcism, though Margaret's physical condition seemed to improve briefly after the priest's departure. Her mental state grew more erratic. The whispers continued, and at times, she would fall into a deep stupor, speaking in that same haunting voice that had echoed in the priest's presence. Frustrated and desperate for answers, Thomas delved deeper into the history of Ravenwood Manor. He visited the village's archives, spending long hours in dusty libraries, poring over old maps, journals, and accounts of the manor's past. What he found was far more disturbing than he could have imagined. The manor's history was not only steeped in tragedy, as he had initially learned, but there were whispers of an ancient ritual, one that could explain the darkness that plagued the house. It was said that the manor had been built atop an old burial ground, one that had once been a place of worship for a secret cult. The cult practiced dark rites and invoked spirits from the other side, performing rituals to manipulate the world of the living. It was believed that these rituals had bound the spirits to the land itself, giving them power over the living who dared to step foot on the sacred ground. Thomas began to understand that the house was not just haunted, it was cursed. The spirits trapped in the walls and the grounds of Ravenwood were angry and vengeful, and Margaret, through her deep connection to the house, had become their chosen vessel. Desperation led Thomas to seek out a second opinion, and he contacted a historian who specialized in occult practices. This historian, an elderly woman named Edith Pemberton, confirmed Thomas's worst fears. The ritual that had bound the spirits to the land had never been fully completed. The dark forces that lingered within the walls of Ravenwood were waiting for the final ritual to be performed, one that would release them from their prison and allow them to reclaim the land. Thomas's horror deepened. He realized that Margaret had unwittingly become a key part of the ritual. In his efforts to save her, he had only played into the hands of the spirits. Now he had no choice but to try to stop the ritual before it was too late, even if it meant sacrificing everything he held dear. As Thomas grew more desperate in his search for answers, he knew time was running out. Margaret's transformation into something unrecognizable had become far too severe. No longer just physically weak, she was now spiraling into an abyss of insanity, plagued by hallucinations, violent outbursts, and a terrifying connection to the house's dark past. It had been days since she last spoke a coherent sentence. Instead, she muttered about figures in the shadows, calling out to people no one else could see. The thought that the spirits in Ravenwood Manor were using her as a vessel, as their way, to complete the unfinished ritual, gnawed at Thomas's mind. He had to act. There was no other choice. The house had taken too much already. It would take his wife, his family, and everything they had if he didn't stop it. Thomas turned back to the old texts he had uncovered, his eyes frantically scanning the pages. There, in an ancient journal of the manor's original owner, he discovered something that nearly sent him into shock. It seemed that the ritual could not simply be broken. It required one final sacrifice, one last offering that would either seal the house forever or release the spirits, allowing them to wreak havoc on the world beyond. There was a choice to be made, but no one could predict the consequences. The journal mentioned that the spirits could only be bound to the land if the person who had become the vessel willingly gave themselves up to the house, if they consented to allow their soul to merge with the spirits of the dead. The process would be agonizing and irreversible, but it would save the rest of the living. The alternative? Allow the spirits to fully possess Margaret and consume everything in their path. In a fit of terror, Thomas realized what had to be done. He couldn't let the house claim his wife, but he also couldn't allow it to break free. The house had to remain locked away no matter the cost. He raced back to Ravenwood Manor, heart pounding. When he arrived, the air was thick, colder than ever, and a sense of finality filled the air. As he entered the house, the shadows seemed to pulse around him, almost alive. He heard Margaret's voice, low and distant, echoing from the darkest corners of the house, calling him. "Come, Thomas," she whispered. "Come join us. Don't fight it. It's so easy." The walls seemed to close in on him, and he could feel the weight of the spirits pressing down on him. Margaret's eyes were no longer the warm, loving eyes he had known. They were hollow, dark pits, consumed by the malevolent force that now dominated her. She stood at the top of the grand staircase, her body bent at unnatural angles, twisted by the power of the house. The house had claimed her, mind and body, and it was too late to save her. But Thomas wasn't giving up. He had a plan, one that could work, but it would require everything he had left. With trembling hands, he took the old ceremonial dagger from the book he had found, the one the journal had described as a means to offer the ultimate sacrifice. The ritual was not meant to destroy the house. It was meant to bind it forever, trapping the spirits within the land and preventing them from entering the world of the living. But there was a price. The dagger was meant to pierce the heart of the one who had become the vessel, and that was Margaret. Tears streamed down Thomas's face as he ascended the stairs, his breath ragged and shaky. He knew that by performing this act he would destroy his wife, the woman he loved more than anything. But he had no choice. Ravenwood Manor had to be sealed, or it would destroy everything. Not just their family, but everyone. Margaret's voice was louder now, a twisted echo of the woman he had known. "Don't do it, Thomas, I'm still here. I can still love you, just come to me." But Thomas pushed past the voice and the sorrow that weighed heavily on his heart. He reached the top of the stairs, where his wife, his love, stood waiting. The dark energy in the room was palpable, overwhelming. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to turn back, to flee with her, to escape the house's grip. But he knew he couldn't. He raised the dagger with shaking hands. "Forgive me, Margaret," he whispered, the words choking him. With one swift motion, he drove the blade deep into her heart. The house groaned, a loud wrenching sound, as if it had been dealt a mortal blow. The walls shook violently and the temperature plummeted to freezing. For a moment there was nothing but an eerie silence. Then the air erupted in an agonizing, terrifying scream. Margaret's body jerked, and the shadows that had clung to the house for so long seemed to writhe, as if caught in their own death throes. Thomas fell to his knees, sobbing, as the house seemed to collapse around him. The light flickered and the temperature began to return to normal. Margaret's body fell still, her soul finally freed from the grip of Ravenwood Manor. But Thomas could barely comprehend what had just happened. He had saved the world from the dark forces, but at the greatest cost imaginable, the love of his life. In the weeks that followed, the silence of Ravenwood Manor seemed to hang in the air. The storms that had plagued the house subsided, and the oppressive darkness that had once filled the halls was now gone. For a time, it seemed as though the evil that had consumed Margaret and the manor itself had been eradicated. The house stood in quiet surrender, its cruel hold broken. Thomas, however, was not at peace. The loss of Margaret weighed heavily on him. She was gone, and no amount of comfort or explanation could ever heal the deep wound in his heart. The very woman he had tried so hard to protect had become a casualty of Ravenwood's curse, a victim of an ancient power he could neither understand nor defeat. Yet in a strange way there was a sense of calm in the aftermath. Ravenwood Manor, though not destroyed, had been sealed. The spirits that had haunted it for centuries seemed to have been put to rest, their final battle fought and won. The dark energy that had once plagued the estate was now dormant, a distant echo of what had come before. But the loss remained. Thomas knew that the house was not truly free of its curse. It had simply been silenced. He could never return to it, knowing what had transpired within its walls. The house had claimed everything, and though it was quiet now, he would always carry the scars of what had happened there. He left Ravenwood Manor behind, taking nothing with him but his memories, and the haunting sense that the spirits of the past might never truly leave. As he walked away from the estate, the weight of his actions hung over him. A constant reminder that sometimes, even the most desperate sacrifices can never fully undo the horrors of the past. Though Thomas had physically left Ravenwood Manor behind, the lingering presence of its curse never truly released him. The mansion, with its dark history, had left a permanent mark on his soul. Margaret's death had broken him, but so too had the realization that he had sealed away the evil, not destroyed it. The spirits of Ravenwood had been trapped, bound by a dark ritual that could never be undone. They were now prisoners, just as he was, a prisoner of the memories that would haunt him for the rest of his days. Months passed since the tragic events unfolded, and though Thomas tried to move on with his life, the experiences he had at the manor kept creeping into his thoughts. Every creak of an old floorboard, every flicker of a light seemed to remind him of that cursed place. It was as if Ravenwood Manor had left an imprint on the very fabric of the world. Even in the safety of his new home, he could feel the weight of its dark energy, like a shadow that would never leave. Thomas began to have dreams of Margaret. In these dreams, she was alive, walking through the manor with him by her side, smiling as though nothing had happened. But in the moments when their hands touched, he could feel a coldness radiating from her, as though she were no longer the woman he had known. Her eyes, once filled with love, now reflected only the emptiness of the house itself. In these dreams, she would speak to him, warning him that the curse had not been fully broken. "The house still remembers you," she would whisper in those haunting dreams. "It has taken what it needs, but it's not done with you yet." Each time Thomas woke, drenched in sweat and breathless, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He tried to ignore it, telling himself that it was just grief, just the mind's way of processing the trauma. But deep down, he knew there was more to it. There was no escape from the house's influence, not even now that he was far away from Ravenwood. The curse, he realized, had attached itself to him in ways he never anticipated. It had become a part of him. One evening, as Thomas sat in the quiet of his new home, he heard it. The unmistakable sound of whispers, soft, insistent, and ever-present. At first, he thought he was imagining it, but then he heard his name. "Thomas." It was Margaret's voice, but distorted, twisted, just like it had been in the house. He froze. The hair on the back of his neck stood on end. The whispers continued, growing louder, more insistent. "Come back, Thomas. Come back to Ravenwood." His pulse quickened. He jumped up, but the room was empty, as it always had been. There was no one there. And yet the whispers continued. They seemed to come from every direction, as if the house itself was speaking to him, calling him back. It was clear now. Ravenwood Manor had not let him go. The curse had followed him, reaching out to claim him once more. In his heart, Thomas knew that the battle wasn't over. The spirits of Ravenwood Manor were still restless, and though the house had been sealed, it would never truly be free of its dark influence. No matter how far he ran, no matter how much time passed, he would never escape the horrors that had been birthed within those cursed walls. Even if he could never return to the manor, he could feel its eyes upon him. And as long as he lived, he would never be rid of the shadows that stalked him from the depths of Ravenwood's haunted past.